The moment Hannah Whitfield picked up the pen, the room went silent. Crystal glasses froze midair. A waiter stopped breathing. Even the soft piano music inside the private dining room at the Plaza Hotel seemed to hesitate, as if the walls themselves understood what was about to happen. Across the table, her husband Caleb Morrison leaned back in his chair, calm, confident, already victorious. Beside him sat Vanessa Cole, legs crossed, lips curved into a smile that didn't bother hiding its cruelty. "Just sign it," Caleb said quietly. "Let's not turn this into a scene." Hannah's hands were shaking so badly she had to steady the paper with her other palm. The divorce agreement lay open on the white tablecloth, right between a half-finished steak and a bottle of red wine that cost more than her monthly salary. This was supposed to be a celebration dinner. Caleb had told her it was about a promotion, about new partners flying in from Manhattan's financial district. He hadn't mentioned the lawyer waiting downstairs. He hadn't mentioned the mistress sitting where Hannah once sat. Around them were people who had known Caleb for years. Investors, colleagues, friends who once toasted Hannah as the perfect supportive wife. Now none of them met her eyes. They stared at the table, at their phones, anywhere but at the woman being quietly erased in front of them. Vanessa let out a soft laugh. "You're doing the right thing," she said, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "Dragging this out would just be embarrassing. Embarrassing." Hannah swallowed hard. She felt the word press against her chest harder than the betrayal itself. For 12 years, she had swallowed everything. The long nights alone, the unexplained transfers from their joint account, the way Caleb corrected her in public, then apologized in private. She told herself this was marriage. This was loyalty. Her eyes blurred as tears slid down her cheeks and dotted the paper. Caleb sighed, annoyed, not concerned. "Hannah, please. We both know you don't have the resources to fight this. Let's end it with dignity." That was when the pen touched the page. No one in that room knew that this signature was not surrender. No one knew that this dinner was not the end of Hannah Whitfield's life. And no one had the slightest idea what would happen once the truth she had buried for 15 years finally came back to claim its debt. The sound of Hannah's chair scraping against the marble floor was louder than the piano. She stood slowly, clutching her coat as if it were the only solid thing left in the room. No one stopped her. No one asked if she was okay. A few heads lifted just long enough to confirm the moment was real, then dropped again. In that private dining room filled with power and money, Hannah Whitfield became invisible the second she was no longer useful. Caleb didn't follow her. He simply nodded to the lawyer, who collected the signed papers with professional efficiency, then raised his glass toward the table as if the evening had merely shifted topics. Laughter returned, awkward at first, then louder. A deal was discussed. A promotion congratulated. Life moved on. Outside, the hallway felt too long, too bright. Hannah's heels echoed with each step, the sound bouncing back at her like accusation. Her phone buzzed once. A notification from her bank. Then another. And another. Account restricted. Payment declined. Card temporarily suspended. She stopped walking. Hannah leaned against the wall, breathing shallow, her chest tight as panic crept in. She opened her banking app with trembling fingers, praying it was a mistake. Their joint account showed a balance so low it barely registered. Savings, 0. Emergency fund, gone. Caleb hadn't just divorced her. He had erased her. She remembered every time he told her, "I'll handle the finances. It's complicated." Every time she trusted him, because that was what good wives did. The realization burned hotter than the tears now streaking her face. Behind her, the restaurant door opened. Vanessa's heels clicked confidently on the floor. She didn't pretend concern. "You should go," Vanessa said softly, almost kindly. "This isn't your world anymore." Hannah looked at her, really looked at her. Perfect makeup, diamond earrings, the faint scent of expensive perfume. A woman who thought she had won something permanent. "I loved him," Hannah whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Vanessa smiled, thin and sharp. That was your mistake. The elevator ride down felt endless. Hannah stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls. Pale, swollen eyes. A woman who looked exactly like the failure Caleb had spent years convincing her she was. When the doors finally opened, cold air rushed in as she stepped outside. Fifth Avenue glittered with life. Taxis honked. Couples laughed. A city that didn't care that her marriage, her home, and her future had collapsed in a single dinner. Hannah pulled her coat tighter and walked into the night with nowhere to go, no money to her name, and no one standing beside her. What she didn't know was that Caleb's greatest mistake wasn't betraying her, it was believing she had nothing left to lose. Hannah spent the night on a wooden bench inside Grand Central Terminal. She hadn't planned to end up there. She told herself she was only waiting for the panic to settle, for her thoughts to slow down enough to make a decision. But hours passed, and the city outside grew quieter while the terminal never truly slept. The lights stayed on, the floors stayed cold, and Hannah stayed still, clutching her purse like it contained something worth protecting. Inside that purse were three things: her phone at 5% battery, an old house key that no longer opened any door, and a folded receipt from the dinner where her marriage ended. Nothing else. At 3:17 a.m., her phone buzzed again. A final alert from the bank. Account closed by authorized party. She stared at the screen until it went dark. That was the moment it fully hit her. Caleb hadn't just planned the divorce. He had planned her disappearance. No access to money, no credit, no address, no leverage. By morning, she would be exactly what he had always implied: she was nothing. Hannah lowered her head into her hands and finally cried the way she hadn't in years. Not quietly, not politely. Her shoulders shook as sobs tore out of her chest, raw and unfiltered. A passing security guard glanced at her, hesitated, then kept walking. In New York, grief was common. Invisible suffering blended easily into the background. When the tears stopped, something else took their place. Anger. She replayed every memory with new clarity. Caleb insisting she sign documents for tax reasons. Caleb discouraging her from working full-time. Caleb isolating her from old friends with subtle remarks about loyalty. None of it had been accidental. It had been strategy. Her phone flickered back to life for a brief second. One missed call. No name. Just a number she hadn't seen in years. She almost ignored it. Then a memory surfaced, her mother's voice, years ago, low and urgent. "If that number ever calls you, Hannah, you answer, no matter what." With trembling fingers, she called it back. The line clicked once. "Hannah," a man's voice said calmly, "I was wondering how long it would take." Her breath caught. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, someone who's been watching them bleed you dry for a very long time. The call disconnected. Hannah sat frozen, heart pounding, staring at her dead phone in the middle of the terminal. Around her, travelers hurried past, unaware that her life had just shifted again, not toward safety, not toward comfort, but toward something far more dangerous. Because for the first time since that dinner, Hannah realized she wasn't as alone as Caleb wanted her to believe. Morning came without mercy. Hannah woke on the bench with a stiff neck and swollen eyes, the constant echo of footsteps reminding her that the world had kept moving while hers collapsed. Sunlight filtered through the high windows of Grand Central, touching faces that belonged to people with places to go. She stood slowly, every muscle aching, and checked her phone out of habit. Dead, completely dead. She felt a sharp wave of fear then, deeper than the night before. Night allowed for hiding. Morning demanded decisions. Hannah walked outside into the cold, pulling her coat tighter as traffic roared past. She tried to remember the last time she had been truly alone in this city. Caleb had always been there, even when he wasn't. His name on leases, his cards in her wallet, his voice deciding things she never questioned. Now there was nothing. She tried calling a former friend from college, using a cafe phone after borrowing a few coins from the counter. Straight to voicemail. Another number. Disconnected. One by one, every bridge she thought she still had led nowhere. Caleb hadn't just controlled the money. He had controlled the narrative. By noon, hunger made her dizzy. She sat on the steps near Fifth Avenue, watching shoppers drift in and out of luxury stores, carrying bags she once believed meant success. She remembered the first time she walked this street with Caleb, how he squeezed her hand and promised she would never have to worry again. That promise tasted bitter now. Her thoughts drifted backward, to a life she rarely allowed herself to remember. A quiet house, a man who smelled of old books and rain, a father who spoke in half sentences and always warned her that wealth attracted predators. After her mother died, everything became sealed, trusts locked, names removed. One night, he was simply gone. People said he had run, others said he was dead. Caleb had known that story when he married her. A chill ran through Hannah as the realization settled. He hadn't chosen her despite her background. He had chosen her because of it. A woman cut off from her past was easy to shape, easy to empty, easy to discard. Her stomach twisted as shame gave way to something steadier. Awareness. Late afternoon, as shadows stretched long across the street, a black sedan slowed near the curb. Hannah barely noticed at first. Cars stopped here all the time, but this one stayed. The window lowered. Hannah Whitfield, a man said calmly, "If you don't get in this car right now, you're going to lose what little protection you still have." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "How do you know my name?" she whispered. The man met her gaze without blinking. "Because your father paid me to find you, if this ever happened." The door opened, and for the first time since the dinner, Hannah understood that her disappearance had been planned, but not by the man who thought he'd destroyed her. Hannah hesitated only a second before stepping into the car. The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound that made her chest tighten. Inside, the sedan was quiet, insulated from the chaos of the street. Leather seats, clean lines. No scent of luxury, just order. The man behind the wheel pulled away from the curb smoothly, as if this moment had been rehearsed. "My name is Arthur Bell," he said after a block of silence. "I was hired to make sure you stayed alive, not comfortable." Hannah swallowed. "By my father?" "Yes." Arthur glanced at her in the rearview mirror. 15 years ago. He was very specific. Her heart pounded. Everyone said he disappeared, that he abandoned everything. Arthur let out a low breath. That's what he needed them to believe. They drove through streets Hannah barely recognized, turning away from Manhattan's bright storefronts into quieter territory. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay grounded. Every instinct told her to be careful. Every memory of her father told her to listen. Arthur continued, "Your husband didn't stumble into power, Hannah. He was looking for leverage long before he met you." Her jaw tightened. "Caleb loved me. Wang's end." Arthur's expression didn't change. Caleb loved access. The words landed hard. Painful, but clean. They explained everything that had never quite made sense. The finances she wasn't allowed to touch. The documents she signed without reading. The slow way her life had been reduced to his shadow. "Last night wasn't about divorce," Arthur said. "It was about timing. Caleb believed he had finally cut the last thread connecting you to your family." End quote. Hannah stared out the window as the city blurred past. Then why now? Why show up after everything was already taken? "Because it wasn't," Arthur replied. "Not yet." The car stopped in front of an unmarked building. No sign, no doorman, just concrete and steel. Inside, an elevator took them down, not up, deep underground. The room they entered was small and secure. A table, 2 chairs, a laptop already open. Arthur gestured for her to sit. "Your father anticipated this exact scenario. He knew someone would try to erase you before you understood what you were worth." Hannah's voice shook. "Is he alive?" Arthur met her eyes. "I can't answer that yet." Frustration surged. "Then what can you tell me?" He slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of trusts, names, signatures, and dates that made her breath hitch. Proof that she had never been powerless, only blocked. Arthur leaned forward. "From this moment on, Hannah, you stop surviving. You start remembering." There stayed no will. Her hands trembled as she closed the folder. Because buried inside those pages was the truth Caleb never wanted her to find, and the first step toward a reckoning no one would see coming. Hannah didn't sleep that night. The room Arthur placed her in was simple, almost bare. A bed, a desk, a lamp that hummed softly when turned on. It felt less like a sanctuary and more like a waiting room between two lives. She sat on the edge of the bed, the folder open in her lap, reading the same pages again and again as if they might change. They didn't. Her name was everywhere. Trust beneficiary, primary heir, protected party, amounts so large they barely felt real. For years, Hannah Whitfield had believed she was dependent, small, replaceable. On paper, she had never been any of those things. Arthur returned just after midnight with 2 cups of coffee. He set one down in front of her without asking. "You should understand something," he said. "Your father didn't vanish because he was weak. He vanished because he saw the trap before it closed." Hannah looked up. "Caleb? Men like your husband don't hunt money," Arthur replied. "They hunt control. Your father knew someone would try to get to you through marriage." Her stomach twisted. Memories rearranged themselves painfully. Caleb's charm, his patience, how he never pushed too hard at first, how he waited until her mother was gone, until her father's name was spoken only in past tense. "Why let me suffer?" Hannah asked, her voice breaking despite herself. "Why watch me lose everything?" Arthur didn't answer right away. "Because protection too early would have exposed him, and because your father needed to know who would show their true face when you were stripped of power." Hannah exhaled slowly. "So this was a test." "In a way," Arthur said, "but not one you were meant to pass alone." He opened the laptop and turned it toward her. On the screen were documents dated years back. Wire transfers. Shell companies. Caleb's name appeared again and again, always adjacent to accounts that didn't belong to him. "Your husband didn't just steal from you," Arthur said quietly. "He stole from the trust. And he did it thinking the only witness was a woman he believed no one would defend." Hannah's hands clenched. "What happens now?" Arthur studied her for a moment. "Now, you decide who you are when no one is forcing you to be small." She closed the folder, finally understanding the weight of it. This wasn't rescue. It was invitation. Outside the room, somewhere far above them, Caleb Morrison was celebrating his freedom, convinced the woman he discarded had vanished for good. He had no idea that the woman he erased was about to step back into the world with her eyes wide open and nothing left to fear. By morning, Hannah looked like a different woman. Not because she had slept, or healed, or suddenly felt strong. She hadn't. But something inside her had settled into place, heavy and unmovable. The kind of calm that only came after you realized there was nothing left anyone could take from you. Arthur was waiting when she stepped back into the small underground room. He slid a tablet across the table without a word. On the screen was a single question. "Do you want to be found?" Hannah stared at it longer than she expected. For years, she had tried to disappear in the safest ways possible. She kept her voice low, her opinions softer, her past locked away. Even last night, sitting on that bench, part of her had hoped to simply fade out of Caleb's life without further damage. To survive quietly? "What happens if I say no?" she asked. Arthur leaned back. "You vanish legally. New name, new location. Your husband keeps what he stole until the system catches him. Years from now, you live comfortably, safely. And if I say yes?" Arthur met her eyes. "Then everything accelerates, and it gets ugly before it gets fair." Hannah thought of Caleb's face across the dinner table, the certainty in his voice when he told her she had no resources. She thought of Vanessa's smile, the way people had looked through her, not at her. "I won't hide anymore," Hannah said. Arthur nodded once. He tapped the screen. Within hours, things began to move. A temporary account was opened in her name. Not wealth, just enough. A lawyer she didn't recognize called and addressed her with respect she hadn't heard in years. Documents were filed. Protections activated. Names she had never been allowed to see before were suddenly CC'd on emails addressed to her. But the most unsettling moment came late afternoon. Arthur returned with his phone in hand. "Your ex-husband has noticed," he said. Hannah's pulse quickened. Noticed what? That a financial institution he's been relying on for years just froze 3 of his accounts. She closed her eyes briefly. "That wasn't us," Arthur added. "That was someone else." Her eyes snapped open. "Who?" Arthur hesitated for the first time. "A man who only intervenes when he's certain." The room felt smaller. "My father?" Arthur didn't answer directly. "He's been very patient." Hannah's chest tightened with a mix of fear and something dangerously close to hope. She stood, hands clenched at her sides. "What do I do now?" she asked. Arthur's expression was calm, almost solemn. "Now you let the world believe you're still broken." He opened the door for her. "Because the moment they realize you're standing," he said quietly, "they'll start panicking." And somewhere across the city, Caleb Morrison was about to learn that the woman he thought he erased had just made her first move. For the next few days, Hannah disappeared on purpose. No social media, no public records, no emotional outbursts that could be leaked or twisted into headlines. To the outside world, she looked exactly like the story Caleb wanted people to believe, a discarded wife licking her wounds somewhere far away, too ashamed to show her face. That silence was not weakness, it was camouflage. From a quiet apartment arranged by Arthur, Hannah watched everything unfold from a distance. News alerts flickered across the television. Financial blogs whispered about irregular activity inside Caleb Morrison's firm. Nothing concrete. Just enough uncertainty to make investors nervous. Just enough tension to tighten the air around him. Arthur stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear most of the time. He spoke in short sentences, rarely explaining. Hannah learned not to ask. Some truths needed to arrive on their own. On the 3rd day, her lawyer called again. This time, the tone was different. Careful. Almost impressed. "Your ex-husband's legal team has requested a delay in finalizing the divorce filing," the woman said. "They're claiming administrative complications." Hannah closed her eyes briefly. Caleb never delayed anything unless he was scared. That evening, Arthur finally sat across from her and spoke plainly. "Caleb is realizing that removing you didn't simplify his life. It destabilized it." Hannah wrapped her hands around a mug she hadn't touched. "He still thinks I'm powerless, doesn't he?" "Yes," Arthur replied, "and he needs to keep believing that." She nodded slowly. The instinct to confront, to demand answers, still pulsed inside her, but she didn't act on it. She remembered the humiliation at the dinner table. The way power worked best when it was quiet. Late that night, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Caleb, I think we need to talk. Things don't have to be ugly." Her chest tightened, but she didn't respond. Minutes later, another message followed. "You don't have to do this the hard way." Hannah turned the phone face down. Across the city, Caleb Morrison sat in his glass-walled office, staring at numbers that no longer obeyed him. Accounts he thought were secure had frozen. Calls he expected to be returned went unanswered. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. And Hannah felt it too, but hers was steadier, quieter, anchored in truth instead of fear. She wasn't chasing justice. She was letting it find its way to her. Because the silence Caleb mistook for surrender was actually the space Hannah needed to let the trap close slowly, cleanly, and without mercy. Caleb Morrison had always believed control was permanent once you took it. On the 4th morning after the dinner, that belief finally began to unravel. He stood in his corner office overlooking Midtown, phone pressed hard to his ear, jaw clenched so tight it ached. The skyline beyond the glass looked the same as it always had, sharp, confident, untouchable. But inside the room, nothing felt solid anymore. "What do you mean the line of credit is under review?" Caleb snapped. "That account has been clean for years." The voice on the other end stayed polite, distant. "We're required to reassess certain relationships when trust structures are flagged. It's temporary." Temporary. The word echoed in his head long after the call ended. Caleb dropped into his chair and stared at the screen in front of him. Numbers refreshed again and again, refusing to stabilize. Investors were asking questions. Partners were suddenly unavailable. A deal he'd been counting on was postponed without explanation. And still, Hannah hadn't responded. That silence bothered him more than the money. He scrolled through their old messages, searching for something: anger, pleading, blame. There was nothing new. Just emptiness where obedience used to be. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept in. Had he pushed too far? Across the city, Hannah sat quietly at a narrow desk, reviewing documents Arthur had left with her. She moved slowly, deliberately, absorbing details she had once been shielded from: names, dates, patterns. Caleb's signature appeared again and again, always just far enough from center to avoid notice. She wasn't angry anymore. Anger required energy. This required precision. Arthur watched her from the doorway. "He's starting to feel it," he said. Hannah didn't look up. "Good. He'll try to reframe the story," Arthur continued. "Paint you as unstable, vindictive." She finally met his eyes. Let him. That afternoon, a familiar name flashed across her screen. Vanessa Cole had posted a carefully worded photo online. Elegant dress, champagne glass, caption about new beginnings and fearless love. Hannah studied it for a long moment. Then she closed the app. Caleb was still clinging to appearances. Vanessa was still performing victory. Neither of them realized that the ground beneath them had already shifted. By evening, Hannah's lawyer called with a quiet update. "Your ex-husband's firm has retained a crisis consultant," she said. "They're preparing for exposure." Hannah leaned back in her chair, heart steady. Exposure meant fear. Fear meant mistakes. She turned to Arthur. "How much longer?" Arthur checked his watch. "Not long." Hannah nodded, eyes calm, voice certain. "Then let him keep believing I'm gone." Because the more confident Caleb felt, the deeper he stepped into his own trap. And when it finally snapped shut, there would be nowhere left for him to run. The call came just after midnight. Hannah was sitting at the small kitchen table, paperwork spread neatly in front of her, when her phone vibrated. She didn't flinch. Over the past few days, she had learned the difference between noise and signals. This felt like a signal. Arthur looked up from across the room. "Unknown number?" Hannah nodded and answered. "Mrs. Whitfield," a male voice said, controlled but tense. "This is Daniel Crane. I represent Caleb Morrison." Hannah didn't respond. "I'm calling to discuss a possible resolution," he continued. "There's been some misunderstanding surrounding recent financial disruptions." "Misunderstanding?" Hannah almost smiled. "You've frozen accounts that don't belong to you," Cron pressed. "This has created unnecessary instability." Hannah leaned back in her chair. "I didn't freeze anything." A pause, just long enough. "Then perhaps," Crane said carefully, "you should speak to your ex-husband directly. He'd prefer to handle this privately." There it was, the shift. The request that revealed fear. "I'll consider it," Hannah replied calmly, and ended the call. Arthur raised an eyebrow. "They're nervous." "They're desperate," Hannah corrected. Minutes later, another call came through. This time, there was no intermediary. "Hannah," Caleb said, his voice strained but trying to sound familiar. "I think things got out of hand." 8. She closed her eyes for a brief second, not in pain, but in clarity. This was the voice she had waited years to hear, stripped of certainty. "You said I had no resources," she replied evenly. Caleb exhaled sharply. "I didn't mean it like that. You know how tense things were." "No," Hannah said. "I know how planned they were." Silence stretched between them. "I can fix this," Caleb said finally. "We can revise the agreement, restore some access. You don't need to drag this into the open." End quote. Hannah looked at Arthur, who gave a slight nod. "I'm not dragging anything," she said. "I'm letting it surface." Caleb's tone shifted. "You don't understand what you're risking." For the first time, Hannah laughed softly. "I understand exactly what I survived." She ended the call. Arthur checked his phone seconds later. He just requested an emergency meeting with his partners. Hannah stood, feeling steady. Grounded. "Good." End quote. She walked to the window and looked out at the sleeping city. For years, she had believed strength was endurance. Tonight, she learned it was boundaries. Caleb Morrison thought this was a negotiation. He still believed the rules belonged to him. He had no idea that by making that call, he had officially stepped into the part of the story where power changes hands and never comes back. The emergency meeting began at 9 sharp. Caleb sat at the long conference table, surrounded by men who had once laughed at his jokes and praised his instincts. This morning, none of them smiled. Phones lay face down, laptops stayed closed. The room felt heavier than it should have, as if the walls themselves were listening. "Let's get straight to it," one partner said, breaking the silence. 3 accounts are frozen, 2 lenders are asking questions, and compliance flagged your name at 2 a.m. Caleb forced a calm expression. "It's temporary. A personal matter involving my ex-wife." That word landed badly. "Personal matters don't trigger trust audits," another partner replied coolly, "unless they intersect with misrepresentation." Caleb's throat tightened. "There's been a misunderstanding. She's emotional, unstable." No one nodded. Across the city, Hannah sat beside Arthur, watching a live financial channel muted on the screen. A banner scrolled along the bottom. "Private equity firm faces internal review." She didn't look away. Arthur checked his phone. "He's trying to isolate you as the problem." Hannah folded her hands. "He always does." Back in the boardroom, a senior advisor slid a folder across the table toward Caleb. "These transfers," he said, tapping the page, "they were approved under your authority, but the originating trust isn't yours." Caleb's pulse spiked. They were marital assets. The advisor shook his head. "They were never legally joint." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. A man at the end of the table leaned forward. "Did you know your ex-wife is listed as a protected beneficiary under an external oversight clause?" Caleb froze. "That's not possible." "It is," the man replied. "And it's why everything stopped the moment she reappeared." Across the city, Hannah's phone buzzed with a single message from her lawyer. "They're panicking." Hannah exhaled slowly. Caleb stood abruptly. "This is being handled. I'll clear it up." 1:40. One of the partners finally spoke with quiet finality. "Until it is, you're stepping back from all decision-making authority." The words hit harder than any accusation. Caleb looked around the table, waiting for support that didn't come. For the first time, he saw what Hannah had seen for years, how quickly loyalty dissolved when control slipped. When the meeting ended, he walked out alone. That same moment, Hannah stood by the window, watching the city wake fully. She felt no joy, no revenge-fueled thrill, just certainty. Because the truth was no longer hidden. And once truth surfaced, gravity did the rest. Caleb Morrison had just lost the room, and he didn't even realize the real reckoning hadn't begun yet. Vanessa Cole woke up to silence she didn't understand. No good morning text from Caleb. No update about the meeting he'd promised would put everything back in order. She lay in his bed, wrapped in expensive sheets, staring at the ceiling of the apartment she already thought of as hers. For the first time since the divorce dinner, something felt off. She checked her phone. 2 missed calls from her agent. 1 message marked urgent. "Call me, now." Vanessa sat up, irritation rising. She slipped into a silk robe and dialed back. The line connected instantly. "What happened?" Vanessa asked, already annoyed. Her agent didn't waste time. "Several brands are pausing your contracts. They're saying your name is suddenly risky." Vanessa laughed. "That's ridiculous. Caleb's firm is fine. This is temporary noise." There was a pause. "Vanessa," the agent said carefully, "this isn't noise. His firm is under internal review, and your name keeps coming up alongside his." Vanessa's smile faded. "That's not possible," she said. "I don't handle his finances." "You don't have to," the agent replied. "Perception is enough." Thanks for watching. The call ended with no reassurance. Across the city, Hannah watched the situation unfold without touching it. Arthur had warned her this would happen. When people tied their worth to borrowed power, they fell fastest when that power cracked. Vanessa tried Caleb again. straight to voicemail. She paced the apartment, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had endured whispers. She had played the role. She had waited. She was supposed to be the upgrade. By noon, tabloids began circling. Not with accusations yet, but with questions. Who really funded Caleb Morrison's rise? Why had his wife disappeared so quietly? Why was the trust name Hannah Whitfield suddenly appearing in places it never had before? Vanessa felt the walls closing in. She finally reached Caleb in the afternoon. "Why didn't you tell me things were this bad?" she demanded. Caleb's voice was tight. "They're not bad. They're complicated." End quote. "That's not what my agent says," she snapped. "I'm losing work." There was a long silence. "You'll have to lie low," Caleb said. "Just for now." Vanessa's chest tightened. "Lie low?" "Yes," he replied, distracted. "This isn't about you." That was the moment Vanessa understood. She hadn't been chosen. She had been convenient. Across the city, Hannah closed her laptop and exhaled slowly. The story was shifting, just as Arthur predicted, pieces falling exactly where they should. Because when borrowed power collapsed, it didn't just take down the man who stole it. It crushed everyone who mistook proximity for protection. The gala had been planned for months. Crystal chandeliers, white linens, a guest list carefully curated to remind the city who still mattered. On the surface, it was a charity event. Beneath that, it was a loyalty test. And Caleb Morrison needed this night to go perfectly. He arrived early, suit pressed, expression controlled. He shook hands, smiled when required, and avoided mirrors whenever possible. Every conversation felt like a performance. Every laugh sounded slightly delayed. He could feel eyes on him, measuring, recalculating. Vanessa didn't come. She claimed a migraine. Caleb didn't argue. He couldn't afford another distraction. Across the room, whispers traveled faster than champagne. Words like review, oversight, restructuring drifted between groups. Caleb nodded along, pretending none of it touched him. He told himself that once this night was over, once the cameras left, he could stabilize things. Then the doors opened. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried. Heads turned in unison. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. A subtle shift rippled through the room, the kind that happened only when something unexpected stepped into view. Hannah Whitfield walked in, not hurried, not hesitant. She wore a simple black dress, tailored, unbranded, impossible to dismiss. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Her posture was calm. She didn't scan the room. She didn't search for anyone. She knew exactly where she was. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be hiding, broken, silent. Hannah moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, acknowledging greetings she hadn't received in years. Some people smiled politely, unsure. Others stared, openly confused. A few recognized her immediately and stiffened. Arthur stood near the back, watching everything. Caleb took a step forward without realizing it. "Hannah," he said, forcing warmth into his voice. "You shouldn't be here." She stopped in front of him and met his eyes. "This is a public event." His smile twitched. "People will talk." "They already are," she replied evenly. A photographer across the room raised a camera. Flash. Caleb leaned closer. "You're making this worse for yourself." Hannah didn't lower her voice. She didn't raise it either. "No," she said. "I'm letting it be seen." Around them, conversations died completely. A man from the board turned slowly toward them, recognition dawning in his expression. Hannah turned slightly, just enough for others to hear. "I was invited," she said, "as a beneficiary." The word landed like a dropped glass. Caleb froze, because in that moment, he understood what was happening. And for the first time since the dinner, fear finally reached his eyes. The woman he erased hadn't come back to beg, she had come back to be acknowledged. For a brief moment, no one moved. The word beneficiary still hovered in the air, heavy and uncomfortable, as if it demanded to be addressed before anything else could continue. Caleb felt every eye shift not toward Hannah, but toward him. The calculation had begun. "That's," An interesting claim, a senior donor said carefully, breaking the silence. Would you like to clarify? Hannah nodded once. She didn't rush. She didn't over-explain. I'm listed under the Whitfield Trust, she said. Some of you have worked with it. Some of you have benefited from it. Recognition flickered across a few faces. Subtle, controlled, but real. Caleb forced a laugh that landed flat. This isn't the time or place for personal matters. It's not one. A man from the board stepped closer. Actually, he said, this is exactly the place. The shift was undeniable now. Conversations resumed, but not as before. They moved around Caleb instead of toward him. Hannah, meanwhile, was being quietly approached. A handshake here. A polite greeting there. Questions asked in low voices. Caleb watched it happen in real time. Someone he'd mentored nodded at Hannah with genuine respect. Another investor excused himself from Caleb mid-sentence to greet her. Each small movement felt like a loss of ground beneath his feet. This is inappropriate, Caleb muttered, leaning toward her again. You don't understand the damage you're causing. Hannah met his gaze steadily. I understand the damage you already caused. A woman from one of the sponsoring firms joined them. Miss Whitfield, she said warmly, we weren't aware you'd be attending. We should talk. Hannah smiled politely. I'd like that. Caleb opened his mouth to interrupt, but the woman had already turned away with Hannah. The photographer returned. Another flash. Caleb stood alone. Across the room, Arthur observed quietly, phone vibrating once in his hand. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. This was the moment the narrative corrected itself. Hannah felt it too, not triumph, not revenge, but something deeper. Restoration. She wasn't pleading for space, she was occupying it. A board member approached her directly. We need to discuss some discrepancies, he said, privately. Of course, Hannah replied. Caleb watched them walk away together, his heart pounding harder than it ever had during any negotiation. He finally understood the danger he was in, not from accusations, but from credibility slipping through his fingers. He had built his world on the assumption that Hannah would stay silent. And now the room had chosen sides. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Because once power stopped answering to him, Caleb Morrison became exactly what he feared most: replaceable. The private lounge behind the ballroom was smaller, quieter, and far more dangerous. Hannah sat at the polished table across from 3 board members and 2 legal advisors she had only known by reputation. No one rushed her. No one questioned why she was there. The moment she spoke the word beneficiary, the rules had changed. We need clarity, one of the advisors said carefully. Your name triggered safeguards that haven't been activated in over a decade. Hannah folded her hands. That was the intention. A pause followed. Then another board member leaned forward. You're aware that the Whitfield Trust was designed to remain dormant unless specific conditions were met. I'm aware, Hannah replied. One of those conditions was attempted misappropriation by marriage. The room went still. Outside, the gala continued, but the laughter felt distant now, like noise from another world. Caleb paced near the bar, checking his phone repeatedly. No messages, no updates. Just the slow, terrifying realization that he was no longer part of the conversation that mattered. Back in the lounge, one of the lawyers spoke again. There's been speculation for years about your father's disappearance. Hannah met his gaze. He didn't disappear. He stepped aside. A breath was drawn. Someone shifted in their seat. And tonight, Hannah continued, her voice steady, he authorized something he hasn't authorized since the trust was created. She reached into her bag and placed a single sealed envelope on the table. The oldest man in the room recognized it immediately. His hand stilled. That seal hasn't been used since he realized someone inside his circle couldn't be trusted, Hannah finished. The man opened the envelope slowly. His eyes moved across the page. Then he closed it again, face pale. We need to adjourn, he said quietly. Immediately. Across the ballroom, Arthur received a single text. 2 words. It's time. Caleb felt it before he understood it. The sudden hush. The way conversations stopped again, sharper this time. The board members emerged, expressions controlled but unmistakably altered. Then the oldest man stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, voice calm but firm. "Before tonight continues, there is a matter of acknowledgement that cannot wait." Caleb's chest tightened. The man turned, eyes finding Hannah in the crowd. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "on behalf of the Whitfield Trust, welcome home." The room erupted into stunned silence. And Caleb finally understood the truth he could never undo. The woman he erased was no longer asking for recognition, she had just reclaimed a legacy. The silence after the announcement felt endless. Hannah stood still, as dozens of eyes locked onto her, not with pity this time, but with recalculation. The kind reserved for someone who had just shifted the balance of a room without raising her voice. She didn't smile. She didn't bow her head. She simply existed in the truth she had reclaimed. Caleb felt the floor tilt beneath him. Conversations didn't resume, they redirected. People leaned toward one another, whispering urgently, phones already in hand. A few discreetly stepped away from Caleb, as if distance itself could protect them from whatever was unfolding. "This is absurd," Caleb said sharply, stepping forward. "There has to be some mistake." No one answered him. One of the board members turned, finally addressing him directly. "Caleb, we need you to remain available tonight. There are matters that require clarification." The word clarification cut deeper than accusation. Hannah watched him struggle to keep his composure, saw the precise moment confidence cracked, his shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightened. For years, she had been the one shrinking under his gaze. Now, the roles were unmistakably reversed. Vanessa appeared at the edge of the crowd, drawn by the shift she could feel even without understanding it. Her face paled as she took in the scene. Hannah at the center, Caleb isolated, the board closing ranks without him. She reached for Caleb's arm. "What's happening?" He pulled away instinctively. "Not now." That single gesture was enough. Vanessa stepped back, realization washing over her in slow horror. Whatever game she thought she was winning had ended without her ever knowing the rules. A legal advisor approached Hannah quietly. "Miss Whitfield, we'll need to formalize protective measures immediately." Hannah nodded. "I understand." Caleb heard that. Protective measures. The phrase echoed in his head as two security staff members appeared not to escort him out, but to ensure he stayed. The message was clear. This night was no longer about reputation. It was about containment. He turned to Hannah, desperation finally surfacing. "You planned this." She met his gaze, steady and unafraid. "You planned my erasure. I planned my return." The weight of the room settled fully then. Caleb Morrison, once the man everyone followed, stood exposed by the very systems he believed he controlled. And Hannah felt it not triumph, not cruelty, but release. Because the fall wasn't happening in shadows. It was happening under chandeliers, cameras, and witnesses who would never forget what they saw. And by the end of the night, everyone would know exactly who had power and who had merely borrowed it. Caleb finally cornered Hannah near the terrace doors. The crowd had thinned, but the tension hadn't. It clung to the air like static, sharp and unmistakable. Music still played somewhere behind them, but it felt irrelevant now, like noise from a life that no longer belonged to either of them. "You humiliated me," Caleb said, keeping his voice low, urgent. "You could have handled this privately." Hannah turned to face him. For the first time all night, they stood alone without witnesses close enough to interrupt. She studied his face, the strain around his eyes, the desperation he was trying to hide. This was the man who once decided everything for her. "No," she said calmly. "I corrected the story." Caleb scoffed. "You're enjoying this." "I'm understanding it," she replied. "There's a difference." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once before stopping again. "You don't know what you've set in motion. The scrutiny, the fallout. People will get hurt." Hannah's voice didn't change. "People were already hurt. You just didn't care when it wasn't you." The words landed cleanly. No accusation, just truth. Caleb's tone shifted, softening into something dangerously familiar. We were good once. You know that. We can still fix parts of this. Hannah felt it then, the final thread trying to wrap itself around her. The old version of him, the one who spoke gently right before taking something else away. She stepped back. You didn't love me, she said quietly. You loved how easy I was to manage. Caleb's eyes flashed. That's not fair. It's accurate, she answered. For a moment, he said nothing. Then anger surfaced, sharp and unmasked. You think marrying into money makes you untouchable? Hannah met his glare without flinching. I think telling the truth makes me free. Behind them, Arthur appeared, presence steady and unmistakable. Two members of the board followed a few steps behind him, their expressions formal. Caleb, one of them said, we need you now. Caleb turned sharply. This isn't over. Hannah nodded once. You're right. He hesitated, as if waiting for her to say more. She didn't. As he walked away, shoulders rigid, Hannah felt something lift from her chest. Not relief, closure. The kind that didn't require apologies or forgiveness. Arthur stepped beside her. You did well. She exhaled slowly. I didn't do anything. I stopped pretending. If too frank, all daughter. Arthur glanced toward the ballroom, where quiet conversations had begun again, this time without Caleb at the center. It's going to move fast now, he said. Hannah looked out at the city lights beyond the glass. I know. Because the confrontation wasn't the end, it was the moment Caleb finally realized there was no version of this story where he won. The fallout didn't wait for morning. By the time Hannah returned to the quiet apartment Arthur had arranged, her phone was already lighting up with alerts she didn't open. She didn't need to. The shift had crossed a threshold, and gravity was doing what it always did once balance was lost. Across the city, Caleb sat alone in his office, long after everyone else had gone home. The lights of Midtown glared through the glass, mocking in their constancy. His phone buzzed again. This time, he answered. Caleb, his attorney said without preamble. We have a problem. Caleb closed his eyes. Define problem. The trust has formally activated oversight. That means a forensic review of every transaction connected to your authority for the last 8 years. Caleb's jaw tightened. That's excessive. It's automatic, the attorney replied. And there's more. 2 partners are distancing themselves publicly. They're claiming ignorance. Ignorance. Betrayal always wore polite language. Caleb stared at the dark reflection of himself in the window. Can we contain this? A pause. Then, not anymore. The next blow came minutes later. A message from Vanessa, long and frantic, accusing him of ruining her career, of lying, of using her. He didn't respond. He didn't have the energy. She had been collateral from the beginning. Now she knew it. By dawn, financial news outlets had picked up the story. Not names yet, just patterns. Analysts discussing governance failures. Anonymous sources confirming internal investigations. Caleb's firm's stock dipped slightly at market open, then more sharply as speculation spread. And then the email arrived. Mandatory leave of absence. Effective immediately. Caleb read it twice. 3 times. The words didn't change. He wasn't fired. Not yet. But he had been removed from the center, from control, from relevance. The worst punishment for a man who had built himself on being indispensable. Meanwhile, Hannah sat quietly with a cup of coffee she barely tasted. Arthur stood near the window, reading updates as they came in. He didn't need to explain them. She could feel the consequences unfolding, layer by layer. Are you okay? He asked finally. Hannah considered the question. Yes, she said, and meant it. She felt no urge to celebrate, no thrill at his unraveling, just a deep, unfamiliar peace. The kind that came when truth no longer needed defending. Because Caleb wasn't being destroyed by her hand. He was being undone by his own decisions, exposed under light he could no longer dim. And as the world closed in on him from every direction, Hannah understood that justice didn't roar. It arrived quietly, all at once, and without mercy. 3 months later, Hannah's life looked nothing like the one she had lost. Not because it was louder, not because it was filled with excess, but because it finally belonged to her. The apartment she lived in now overlooked the river, not the skyline. It was quiet in the mornings, the kind of quiet that allowed thought instead of demanding performance. Hannah woke early, not out of anxiety, but habit, and drank her coffee by the window while the city stretched awake below her. She worked again, not for survival, not for appearances. She worked because she wanted to. Hannah had taken a role within the Whitfield Trust itself, overseeing programs her father once designed in silence. Education funds, legal protections for vulnerable beneficiaries, systems meant to stop exactly what had been done to her. People listened when she spoke now, not because of her last name alone, but because she understood the cost of being unheard. Arthur visited less frequently. His job was nearly done. One afternoon, as they reviewed final reports, he closed the folder and looked at her thoughtfully. "You didn't have to step into this world so fully," he said. "Many don't." Hannah smiled faintly. "I spent too long being erased. I won't disappear again." News of Caleb came occasionally, always secondhand. A settlement, an ongoing investigation, a firm quietly restructuring without him. His name no longer carried weight. Vanessa had vanished from public view entirely, her social media scrubbed clean. The silence that once belonged to Hannah now belonged to them. One evening, Hannah attended a small dinner. No press, no spectacle, just conversation. Julian Reed sat across from her, sleeves rolled up, listening more than speaking. He had been there through the aftermath, steady and present, never pushing, never rescuing. "You seem lighter," he said gently. "I am," Hannah replied, "because nothing I have now is borrowed." Their relationship grew slowly. No declarations, no urgency, just trust built in real time, without fear of being managed or minimized. When he asked her months later if she would consider a future together, it didn't feel like escape. It felt like choice. Hannah stood one night on the balcony, city lights reflecting softly in the glass, and thought about the woman she had been at that dinner table months ago, shaking, apologizing, believing silence was safety. She wasn't angry at her anymore. She was grateful, because she had survived long enough to become someone no one could ever erase again. And for the first time in her life, Hannah Whitfield wasn't rebuilding, she was finally living. The wedding was small by design. No press, no headlines, no reminder of the world that once tried to define Hannah Whitfield before she was ready. It took place on a quiet stretch of land just outside the city, where the river curved gently and the noise of ambition never reached. Only people who mattered were there. People who had stayed, people who had never needed proof. Hannah stood beneath a simple arch of white flowers, sunlight warming her face, and felt something she once believed was impossible. Peace. Julian Reed waited for her with no impatience, no ownership in his eyes. When he took her hands, it wasn't to claim her, but to meet her. Equal, present, steady. The vows were quiet, spoken clearly, without drama or promises built on illusion. They spoke of partnership, of choice, of walking forward without fear of being diminished. When they kissed, there was no applause that shook the air, just soft smiles. Quiet tears. Approval that came from understanding, not spectacle. Later, as the evening settled into laughter and low conversation, Hannah stepped away for a moment and looked out at the water. The wind moved gently through her hair. She thought of the dinner table where everything ended. The bench where she cried until she couldn't anymore. The moment she realized silence wasn't safety. Julian joined her, slipping a hand into hers. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Hannah smiled. "Only that I didn't choose myself sooner." He squeezed her hand. "You did, when it mattered." They returned to the gathering together, not as a symbol, but as two people who had arrived at the same place from very different paths. Caleb Morrison's name came up once that night, briefly, without emotion. Someone mentioned he had finalized a settlement and moved out of the city. No one lingered on it, no one cared. That was the final justice. Months later, Hannah would stand in a boardroom, not as a wife, not as an accessory, but as a voice people waited to hear. She would protect others the way she once needed protection. She would build systems that didn't rely on silence to survive. And sometimes, late at night, she would sit beside Julian and let herself be held without calculation, without fear of losing ground. Hannah Whitfield had not been rewarded with riches she didn't earn. She was rewarded with clarity, with dignity, with love that didn't require shrinking, because the greatest victory was never revenge, it was the life she built after no one could control her story again. So, the story has come to an end. And if you're still here with us right now, really still here, then something in this journey must have touched your heart in a quiet way. What Hannah's story reminds us is not about wealth, revenge, or winning in the loud sense. It's about dignity. It's about that moment in life when you realize that staying silent to keep the peace is slowly destroying you. The Stoics once said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." And that is exactly what healing looks like in real life. Not screaming, not proving, but choosing yourself when it matters most. Many of us have been Hannah at some point. We stayed too long. We trusted too deeply. We believed endurance was love. But as Epictetus taught, no man is free who is not master of himself. The moment Hannah stopped shrinking, the world adjusted. Not because she became cruel, but because she became clear. If this story resonated with you, maybe it's because you're standing at your own quiet crossroads, and that's okay. Growth doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like boundaries. Sometimes it looks like walking away with your head held high. If this message spoke to you, please like the video, share it with someone who might need it tonight, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, not just entertain.